Man on the moon. Check. Smallpox no longer an issue. Check. Slavery outlawed. Check. Extreme poverty eradicated. Not even close yet. But imagine a world with no one living on less than $1.50 a day. A world with no AIDS. A world with no malaria. A world with every kid in school. Imagine if these were the victories of our times. Now today here at TED, I want to share two ideas with you. The first, you will no doubt love. The second may challenge some of you. And the first is this. In the next 30 or 40 years, we will see incredible things happen on our planet. And the levels of poverty and disadvantage that we're currently seeing in our world may well be put in the history books. But the second thing is this. Not many of us in this room, myself included, will be the heroes of this story. The true heroes will be the local leaders with local solutions to local challenges working at the grassroots in the fight against extreme poverty. And I now have 16 minutes to back up those claims before I'm thrown to the lions. Now, I left school as a 17-year-old thinking I'm going to change the world. And I just happened to do that through the military. And that sounds funny, I know, but I grew up in a generation where the military did good things. We liberated a newly independent East Timor. We did peacekeeping operations in Rwanda. And I went on and did my officer training, and then I found myself on a Navy diving course. Started the course with 25, and 3 weeks later we're down to 8. And I was freezing cold on a very, very dark night in Sydney in 2001. And we heard a diver recall device, which means get out of the water fast, something is going wrong. So we swam to the surface. On the surface, they tell us to get out of the water. We're running down the wharf, and we're thinking, what are they going to do with us now? Are we going to run to Manly and back? What have they got in store for us? But we ran into a small room, and we saw something that none of us expected to see. That second plane smashing into the Twin Towers in New York. I was 17 years old. And 8 hours later, I got a phone call saying that I was deploying to the Middle East to join a small team to enforce UN sanctions. And our briefing was very simple. No oil out of the country, no food or medicine into the country without the UN stamp. I turned 18 2 days before I arrived up there. And I came back with medals on my chest and pats on my back, people saying, you've done a great thing. But I didn't know if I had. And over the years that followed, I started to research into the impacts of these sanctions that I had enforced. I learned that 250,000 women and children died because of these sanctions. Through a video of Albright, when she was asked, was it worth the cost? She said, yes, it was. But I didn't know if it was anymore. And in 2003, when I watched as the country was invaded, I watched on television when I was at the Defence Force Academy, I felt like I'd done a terrible thing. I felt like I'd made the world a bit worse. So I wanted to bring balance back to the world. And I passionately studied and I traveled, getting a different perspective on what change could look like and what hope could look like on our planet. And I started to get that crazy idea in my head that if I was clever enough, that one day I could go to New York and hang out in the UN with some rich old white men who had a big plan to fix it all. And I was going to be part of that. But I wanted to back that idea with reality. And this was what was being fed to me. The idea that if enough, in Australia, if enough middle-class white kids got together, we could go to a rock concert to convince our basically middle-class white politicians to give more money to the middle-class white guys in New York who had the big plan to fix it all. And I arrived in Kenya after my one-way flight 2 days before the national elections in that country, which descended into madness. 3 months after that, we went to Tanzania to run a secondary school for street kids. And I still had this idea in my head that I could run a best practice project for a year in Tanzania. I'd show Africa what a best practice school for secondary kids looked like. And then I'd go to New York, hang out with all the white guys, and get this problem solved, give it 3 or 4 years, and I'd be done. And the first day when I arrived at this school, we're driving to the school and I'm getting a briefing on what it's like. I was 24 years old and they said, well, the buildings have fallen apart. The termites got into those 2 years ago. And then they said, well, the teachers aren't really coming anymore. And of the 250 kids, only 30% of them are actually coming to school. I said, is anyone learning anything in this school? And they said, yeah, definitely. We've had of our 250 kids, one kid each year for the last 3 years pass the national exams. I was super excited about him. So I thought, wow, this naive idea that I could just go there for a year. I wrote the essays, I had all the answers. It was suddenly looking a little bit more challenging than I first thought. But instead of going straight to the school, we get diverted to the local prison, where one of our boys has been arrested that morning for beating up a teacher so badly that the teacher is now in hospital and this boy is in prison, looking at about 5 to 10 years for the seriousness of this assault. We spent 6 hours getting him out of prison, and we're driving to this school, finally to arrive there at 12 o'clock at night. It's a good first day on the job. But the woman who's giving me the half-day briefing before she flies back to New York, she laughs as we're pulling into the school. She said, Aaron, I wasn't going to tell you this, but I will. The boy we just got out of prison, he's the head boy of the school. He's the best that we've got. And it was there that I realized this is going to be really, really tough. And I was in that job for a few months and we were starting to fix the school. We were starting to bring together a local staff of teachers. The kids were starting to learn. And my confidence started to build. I'm thinking, I wrote essays about this. I got inspired about this. The guys in New York are going to be so happy with me at UN headquarters. And pretty soon I'll be hanging out with them and we'll get this thing figured out in just a couple of years. But I found myself at a funeral. And it wasn't the first funeral I'd been to in that place. It was the third funeral I'd been to in 3 days. All for kids under 10. All of them in coffins because of AIDS. And as I looked around at that funeral that day, I saw people screaming and tearing at their clothes, but I saw one small boy, and he wasn't making a scene like everyone else. He just had a tear running down his cheek. And I knew he was devastated because his friend was going down that coffin. He looked terrified. Terrified of what the future held for him. Terrified that maybe he'd be going down in a coffin in the months or years ahead. And that day, that kid broke my heart. But he also made me realize in a very powerful way that change was never going to come from me in this slum. Change had to come from the people at that funeral. Change had to come from that small boy. Change had to come from the people who want to change more than I could ever want change in that place. And I ran home to our little shack in the slum and I started writing. And that was the beginning of what is now Spark International, not-for-profit, that exists to enable change makers in some of the poorest places on the planet. And I'll be talking more about that in just a few minutes. But this feeling I had was, you know what, the model is not working. What I was learning in my studies and what I was so passionate about, it's not working. And if you haven't studied international development, I'm going to save you 2 years of a master's degree and a few $1,000s of tuition, which I'm sure the recruitment guys at Macquarie are going to be very upset at me about. And I'll give you the quick brief. After World War II, a number of organizations are built, IMF, World Bank, United Nations. And the plan is this. Economic growth in the Western sense is a great thing. Let's do it worldwide, and the profits of this will trickle down to the poor. Now, this kind of works in Asia, but Africa gets worse during this period. A few years ago, we're told that some guys in New York again get together and they say, we've got 8 Millennium Development Goals. These are the 8 goals that will halve poverty in 15 years. And we're now a couple of years away from that finishing up. And while there's been some good gains made in some countries, many countries will not get even close to the targets. And in fact, Papua New Guinea, a country 12 kilometres to the north of Australia, is off track on every single one of these goals. So I kept asking this question, is the model working? At that day, at that funeral in Tanzania, the big plan didn't seem that relevant. And New York seemed a long way away from this slum. These are not just my delusional ideas. I mean, Spark is an organisation that passionately believes that local leaders with local solutions to local challenges, these will provide the strongest answers to poverty and disadvantage in our world. But if we look at Malawi, There's a group called Population Services International. Their headquarters are in Washington, but they give a lot of trust to their local staff. And this small Malawi team were given a briefing to say, you've got to really, really hit malaria head on in your country. So they came up with a very innovative idea. And their idea was this: let's get the nurses who are serving mothers and newborns in the clinics to sell malaria nets to the mothers for 50 cents. They'll talk to them about the process and say, this is why it's so important. In the urban areas, we'll sell the nets for $5, and that will subsidize the sales in the rural areas. Meanwhile, across the border in Zambia, USAID, the foreign aid branch of the US government, is spending millions and millions and millions of dollars giving out free malaria nets to everyone, because this was their plan to knock malaria off. It's coming from a beautiful place, and they're trying extremely hard, yes. But the result is that 5 years later, when they do follow-up surveys, they're finding that 90% of the people who are given these nets are no longer using them. Over the border in Malawi, the Population Services International project, they're finding that almost every single person is still using the nets, or they're buying the nets through the same process. It's a huge impact. They also find that when they started the idea, 8% of kids in the country were sleeping under malaria nets. 5 years later, credited to their idea and their program, 60% of kids in the country are living under malaria nets. And this is working. It's a local idea to a local challenge, led by local leaders. Let's go across to South America, Brazil. Vera Cordeiro is a Brazilian doctor, and she's sick to death of seeing kids come into her hospital and come back week after week with the same preventable ailments. So she says, why don't we step out of the walls of the hospital and move into the favelas and actually understand what's happening here? And they do it. She launches an organization called Renascer in the 80s, and the impact is astounding. The hospital that she first started using these ideas in, within a year, the inpatients was 70% less. Huge impact. What about in our own backyard? Manningrida, Arnhem Land. A very, very troubled society, very violent, a lot of drug use. And 4 Indigenous Australian women pick up 4 singlets and 4 torches and join they form the Child Protection Service. And their idea is very simple. We're going to be out here all night convincing these kids to go back home, to go to sleep, to stop using drugs. They've got nothing to work with except 4 torches and 4 singlets. And their impact is wonderful. So it's happening here in our own backyard as well. So what is our role? I hope you're not thinking, God, that's great, Aaron. I feel incredibly disempowered. I have no idea what I'm going to do. Well, I think we have an incredible role to play as enablers of these local change makers. And what we're working on at Spark is an idea that will really help people to do that. A dilemma that I often face is this. If I give a speech about my experiences in Africa, a lot of people come to me at the end, often young girls, and they say to me, Aaron, I've always wanted to go to Africa. So here's my details, and I'm going to come and help you guys. And I say, well, you're listening to what I was saying. But it's coming from such a wonderful place, and they have this incredible heart, this huge passion to see change. And that's an incredible thing. But their ability to take tangible action is pretty tough, because there's a lot of barriers that are going to come up against them. First of all, their parents are probably not wanting them to go to Africa because it's a little bit dangerous. The second thing is it's a way away, and it's a very expensive flight. Visas and vaccinations, these things add up. So the chance that this very passionate girl, let's call her Sarah, and Sarah's from Chatswood, the chance that Sarah is actually going to go to Africa and actually see her passion turn into some tangible action on the ground is already looking pretty bad. The reality is, if she gets there, the first 3 to 6 months of her work, she might actually make that community worse off if she's going into a very poor community, because it's such an outside idea. There's so many culture shocks happening. And I'm saying that because that's exactly what I did in Africa. So Sarah's huge passion is not being connected to tangible action. And that's a tragedy, and that's a dilemma. On the flip side, in South Africa, let's use another hypothetical. Let's say Margaret. Margaret is a Spark change maker. She's a local South African woman. She lives in Soweto, and she's very, very passionate about AIDS because she's seen it ravage her community. She wants to see it ended. And she has a very, very innovative idea to do that. She's accountable. She's very intelligent. She's well trained. and she knows how she can do this. But her parents died of AIDS a couple of years ago. So she actually can't take any slack in her life. There's huge barriers that are up against her. So Margaret's huge passion is not being connected to tangible action. Another tragedy and another dilemma. So what we're working on at Spark is something that will bring that together. Sarah hears about Spark, or she comes onto our website, or one of us speak, and she says, I'm so passionate. She goes online, she says, I'm passionate about Africa. It narrows in. I'm passionate about women. It narrows in again. The biggest challenge is AIDS. Narrows in again. And she sees Margaret's smiling face. She watches a 5-minute video about what Margaret is doing in Soweto. She gets excited. She gives $20. The little bar graph goes across saying, Margaret's now 86% of the way there. Help her get to 100. So Sarah shares it with her friends. They get excited. The money gets raised. And we're talking small focus money here, under $1,000 for many of these projects. So we've got that first flow going, which is the finances, which is great. We also want to see the encouragement going, which is Sarah saying, this is incredible. Keep going, Margaret. I'm cheering you on. Margaret sends back the impact, what we were talking about before with the social return. She's saying, this is what I did with your $20. Look at this project. It's incredible. Thank you so much. We've now got this cycle going. If Sarah wants to go to Soweto one day to meet Margaret, she can. But she's going as a champion of that cause, to fall in love with that cause, and to come back to Australia and to Chatswood and to say, we've got to build something huge around this. And that's what we're working on. So we're working to build the army of changemakers right now, and we're also working to build the army of Sarahs, the enablers of that change. We're just flipping things on its head a little bit. This is how change will come. When local leaders stand up with local solutions to local challenges, and when we, passionate people with the ability to take great action, take that action and enable their local change. Now to finish up, guys, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to show you the change makers that we have in Papua New Guinea who are already doing this right now. So thank you very much.